Very kind words. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Many, many thanks to Fatma for putting this show on the road. Really wonderful. Great. And I hope that I can live up to your expectations. This title comes from Fatma, actually. So, well, here we go. Okay, so are all young bilinguals the same? Of course, you know they're not. Anyway, but before we really start and dig in, I just want to make a few general remarks here. When I'm talking about bilingual, I basically mean more than one language or more than one language variety. But we really don't know that much about trilingual acquisition, but I've already noticed a poster here that's starting to change that. I'm also going to be focusing on spoken language, so not on signed language. There are, of course, children growing up bilingually with both oral and signed language. Speech, well, signed speech, yeah, I suppose you could say that. But the research basis here is also still quite thin, although it's expanding. I am going to focus on young children who have not received any formal instruction yet. So normally that's about children up to about age 6. Except I'm going to be talking about this large survey that Dr. Lanvers already mentioned, and that includes also somewhat older children. Okay, so as I posited in 1990, when we really didn't know so much yet about bilingual acquisition, is I defined 2 fundamentally different bilingual language learning environments for young children. I wasn't the only one to do this. Jürgen Meisel had done it before me, and a few others, but people hadn't really paid much attention to this generally before then. So what are these 2? Well, that's bilingual first language acquisition. So it's an input environment. Namely, children regularly hear 2 languages, and I call them A and Alpha because there's no chronological difference, spoken to them from the start, between brackets, birth, I'll say a little bit about that in a moment, and early second language acquisition, where children clearly start off being addressed in just a single language, which is their L1, because it's their first. And they start to be regularly addressed in a second language some time after. Okay. Yeah, there are all kinds of issues. I'm fully aware of that. In any case, what I want to stress here, it's an input-based distinction. So it's about the environments in which children grow up. Now, I want to say here that for all children, the actual language input to them may not start until a few weeks after birth. I have tried to look about, to get information about it, and maybe Dr. Wieman will know a lot more about this, is when do parents, caregivers actually start to really talk to their babies. This very early infant-directed speech. In my own experience, I know mothers who interact and talk to their little babies from day 1, but then there are several others who don't start to really talk to their babies much until the babies are about a month old. Definitely talking starts when there is the social smile at 6 weeks. But I think there is so when do kids really start to hear speech exactly? Well, I'd like to know about it, but I'm not doing any research about that. And fathers, well, we don't know much about that either. We do know, though, that already during pregnancy, children, of course, can pick up some elements, prosodic elements of speech, and we even have a study by Krista Byers-Heinlein a while ago where she looked at mothers who spoke Tagalog and English while they were pregnant, and then compared those children from those mothers to children who had only heard English, so to speak, while they were still not born. So, and there was already some difference there. Anyway, so this idea of they start to have input from birth is a little fuzzy. You've got to be a little realistic about that. But what is very clear is that in BFLA, typically a child will hear 2 languages at home. And this is very different from early second language acquisition, where typically there will be 1 language at home, and the second language comes in through daycare or preschool or a nanny who's hired. That's also possible. That could then bring the language to the home. If that nanny is a live-in nanny, that's definitely possible. But the more typical situation would be the daycare preschool situation. And I'll refer to that as the school language, even though a daycare, of course, is not school. It's usually the majority language. It is possible that it's not, that in fact, at home the majority language is being spoken, and that if you put your kid in a total, for instance, an English immersion program in Hong Kong, let's say, or in Singapore, let's say, and you're speaking Chinese at home, well then, it's hard to say about Singapore. You'd be the specialist on that, whether English is... Okay, let's not take Singapore, because there, of course, English is also still a majority language, or one of the majority languages. But in any case, there are other settings where parents elect to have the kid immersed in a language that is not the local majority language. But typically, it would be the other way around. It would be the minority language that's spoken at home and the majority language spoken outside the home, including in school. Very recently, I found out through a recalculation I did that BFLA occurs about 3 times as frequently as ESLA, so the input environment. So it's far more common for children to hear the school language and another language X at home rather than just a language X. And the evidence for that comes from 2 large surveys of home language use, where from those surveys, so those surveys were larger than the numbers I'm about to present, but in what I'm presenting, I've selected the families where the parents speak a language X at home, so with or without the school language. And so there's 2 main samples here from Belgium and the United States, with virtually identical percentages of BFLA and ESLA. Is very striking, really, for a large number of families in Belgium. So the Belgium data come from my own survey, and here I'm only listing the dual parent families, in addition to the 1,778 dual parent families where a language X was spoken at home. There are also single parent families, and also there are families where there are 2 languages X spoken at home. For the United States samples, the data there, the article by Adam Winsler from George Mason University et al. Doesn't mention whether it's dual parent families or not. In any case, it's totally striking. 24% ESLA in the Belgium survey, 76% BFLA, 25% in the United States survey, and 75%. That is really striking to have in such hugely different geographies to have these very similar findings, basically. Now, this is carrying it a little further. So the different language input environments for young children lead to, and I hope to show you that today, basically different learning and use trajectories in young children. We now have research that can speak to that. And also a very different personal experience with bilingualism and both languages for the children and their families. Now, compared to ESLA and BFLA, families have really different connections and experiences. Most BFLA families have emotional, cultural, and family connections with both languages and want their children, to speak both at home. This is very different. Most ESLA families, well, they have a very strong emotional, cultural, and family connection with just a single language, X. Except, of course, when we're talking about BFLA families with then an added 3rd language. And there's, at home, in most ESLA families, at home there's usually little engagement with the school language, the L2. And there's no expectation that at home the children are going to be speaking the L2. They are just expected to speak the LX, the home language, basically. So that is very different, really. Now, in spite of input in 2 languages, children may speak only a single language. And this is where that famous survey comes in, where I'm here presenting information about the children in a total of 2,250 families. So those 1,778 families I showed you a few slides before, they're part of the 2,250 families here. And this survey was focused on 6 to 9-year-old children and their families. So in each of those families, there's at least one child between age 6 and 9. And there may be younger siblings, there may be older siblings. In total, we have data on 5,320 children. So that's all the siblings, including those between 6 and 9 years of age. And that was done in Flanders in the 90s, actually, this survey. What we found is just the home language use. 75% of children actually speak 2 languages. So they speak the Dutch, so the school language, and they speak the X language. But 25%, that's 1 in 4. 1 in 4 families, basically. In 1 in 4 families, children do not speak the X language. So what we expect from monolingual acquisition, that children speak the language that they actually hear, and if they don't, we think they have a hearing problem or there's some other problem that affects their ability to learn language. In the bilingual setting, 1 in 4, well, that's not a huge exception. It is a common pattern, common finding. We didn't know that until then. So what does this mean for families' expectations and the difference between BFLA and ESLA? Well, when I took in the survey just the BFLA families, well, there we find in 70% of BFLA families, children speak both languages, as the families would expect. But in 30% of BFLA families, they really speak just a single language. And this is in contrast to ESLA, where it's only in just 3% of, but it's still 3%, which may be surprising, but it's just 3% of ESLA families where the children do not speak the L1. But in 97% they do. So for BFLA, the reality goes against expectations for nearly 1/3 of families. That's huge. In ESLA, what actually happens? Well, it seems to fit the expectations for most families. So that's one major difference. Speaking 2 languages or not speaking 2 languages, that's really quite fundamental. And if BFLA children, if they speak only a single language at home, that language is invariably the school language. And in fact, this has been found all over the world that children do learn the school language, even though in the media we might hear completely different things. But that's just not true. Children do learn the school language. In any case, for a difference between BFLA and ESLA, well, that's the same. If ESLA children speak only a single language, eventually, when they're older, yeah, it'll also be just the school language. But we've just seen that BFLA children stand much more of a chance of not speaking the non-school language than ESLA children. And as I just mentioned, ESLA children may also lose their first language, but that loss, from my general reading of the literature, tends to occur at a much later age than in BFLA children, who may already lose it in preschool. I'll show you some data, I think also the first of its kind, on a BFLA group of children with Dutch and French input from birth in a one-person, one-language input setting, who at age 20 months, we have CDI data about them, so their word knowledge, basically. And we all of these children were at age-appropriate levels in both languages, both Dutch and French, when they were 20 months of age. So they were actually speaking for their age. They were speaking 2 languages, yeah, appropriate for their age. But then we recorded those same children when they were 4 years of age, and we found this pattern that I'm about to explain to you. Well, we had for the total group, so just looking at very roughly, are they speaking a particular language, Dutch or French? Are they maybe saying only single words? At age 4.5, more or less, we're not expecting children to only say single words. We are actually expecting them to say complex sentences at age 4.5. So there's in between single words and complex sentences, you have multi-word clauses. So single clauses consisting of 3, 4, or maybe 5 words. Yeah. So what we want is we want these kids, we would expect that also, if they're going to be developing in an age-appropriate manner, we would expect them to say complex sentences in both languages at age 4.5. Well, we don't find that. We only find that for Dutch, we have 22 out of the 24 children who actually do that. So that's most of those children. And let me tell you that there's no child who doesn't do complex sentences. So all of these children do complex sentences in at least one language, which shows that they have no general language learning problem, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to do that. So what that means, for instance, for a child that has no speech in Dutch, well, that same child will have had complex sentences in French. For the single child that has only single words in Dutch, well, that child will have had complex sentences in French. So how I'm presenting these data is just I counted how many did do X in Dutch and how many did do X in French. But you see, there are very few children, really only 11 out of the 24, who were doing French complex sentences. Let's not forget all those, who had no speech in French, only single words, only multi-word clauses. They all have complex sentences in Dutch. Let's not forget that. So we've got to look at the entire picture. But what this shows is that French is definitely for at least, 11 of those children. Am I counting right? 13 of those children, sorry. French is kind of on the way out. It is not developing as we would have wanted. It's a kind of attrition process that we see here. And when they're not speaking French, well, that's all, they've already had it, at least for production. Yeah? For comprehension, that's another matter. I'm looking at production here. So that's already at age 4.5, we can see language attrition going on in BFLA preschoolers. Yeah. On the whole, what are some typical global developmental trajectories for comprehension in BFLA and ESLA before age 6? I think it's very important for especially younger children, I would say under age 3 definitely, to really look at comprehension and production separately. So very typical, this is a result of them hearing 2 languages pretty much every day, is that BFLA children learn to understand 2 languages at the same time. And for ESLA, that's a very clear difference. They first learn to understand only a single language. And so by age 1, BFLA children will have their L1, LA, and that will just normally increase their knowledge of comprehension up until age 6. And we have that same picture for the ESLA children. So there is, for one language, the development is pretty much the same. Then for the other language, language alpha in the BFLA children, we also have that, by age 1, they'll be able to understand quite a lot of words and their knowledge will increase. But for ESLA, we get a very different picture for that second language. It's much later. And when does it start? Well, it all depends, very variable, on the age of first regular exposure. We have some very, very few data about that. Unfortunately, we really don't know all that much about it, but there's been work by Houwer in the United States suggesting that, well, it takes at least, after first exposure, it takes a month at least for older children to 4-year-olds to start to understand something of the new language. In any case, once this starts, this comprehension in the second language, it continues. We imagine, nobody's ever said anything else, let me put it that way. I don't think it's a controversial statement. Then what about production? And I'm here focusing on just the typical developmental trajectories and the global ones. Again, contrasting BFLA and ESLA. Well, it's quite clear by age 2, language A, language alpha can be produced in both by bilingual children, all bilingual children, BFLA children, that have been studied have shown this pattern. Now, in ESLA, we've got language 1 that's produced by age 2, although we really know very, very little about that. I'm just saying that because we know that from monolingual first language acquisition. And of course, these children are, at the beginning, monolingual, in ESLA. So that's why I'm saying that, even though we don't necessarily have that knowledge about children who are later going to be exposed to another language. So that's just the monolingual pattern, let me put it that way. And then here for BFLA in production, because of those big survey findings, I'm making a distinction between 2 basic types of BFLA. BFLA 1, if you like, for about 3/4 of children, could be fewer, 2. It's just the present survey data, but there's only 2 surveys, it's also limited data. They show an increasing proficiency in both languages until age 6 and up. And then we have a second category of BFLA children, 1/4 of children, or maybe more, we don't know, an increasing proficiency in only one language. So attrition of the other language, which is coming out of these survey results. Now, how about for ESLA children? In production, language 2 will develop much later. But at what point, we don't really know, because first of all, there's so much variation in when children start to hear their first language, their second language, and as I'll show a little more later, there's a huge amount of variability amongst children. But there will be increasing proficiency in that language until age 6 and up, and maybe when they're a little older and they're getting much more proficient in that second language, maybe that's when they stop speaking the first language. We don't know, but it could be that that's a reason. Here I want to show things in a little slightly different way. So I'm focusing now on the LX, so the language that is not the school language. I think that's important to conceptualize too. And at the bottom you see I've put out ages from 0 to 6. Now my PowerPoint drawing possibilities, like this would be the line for comprehension for all 3. Of course, it's not such a straight line, okay? It probably has a slower beginning and then it goes off and it takes off, yes? But that's just because PowerPoint is hard. But somewhere before the first birthday, children start to understand words, and it just continues and goes way up. And that's probably the same for all these bilingual children. Then here we have for production of BFLA 1 and ESLA. We're talking just about the one LX language here. Again, production starts somewhere along in the second year of life and goes on. Again, it's not such a completely straight line. Okay. Here, I really, I'm very proud of my red curved line. It took me a long time to find that, how to be able to do that. And this is where I would see is production for BFLA 2. So where we know, I assume on this very small study of these 24 children, for the rest we don't have any data about that, not any group data. Well, we might have actually, I'll have to check on that. We might have, in fact, Should be. Some data from Erica Hoff. I apologize. I have to check on that. Yes, but I think there also, you know, the children produce words in 2 languages at age 2. Yeah. And what I found is then starting around age 4, well, that productions is basically like the language doesn't come to real fruition, maybe. I mean, it's a kind of a dangerous statement, maybe, but there's attrition. I would say that there's attrition. And so here we see, on the one hand, ESLA is similar to one type of BFLA, and, well, BFLA 1 and ESLA are different from BFLA 2 for that time period. That's about just the LX. Now, many people are only interested in what happens to the school language or the majority language. We should be interested in both languages, but anyway, here it is for the school of majority language. So here, yes, I now knew how to do curved lines, more or less. So here we have comprehension for BFLA. It starts more or less at the same time as for the LX. Actually at the same time, before age 1, with maybe a difficult start, and then it just takes off. And this little dip there here, well, that shouldn't really be in there. I'm sorry. That's my lack of PowerPoint. Oops. Here we have production for BFLA. So also, you know, that's just the school language. That is not. It's not the school language that loses out. It's the LX that loses out. And here we have for ESLA comprehension, and I've taken it to start at about age 3. It could start earlier, depending on when the child actually finds him or herself in a daycare setting or a preschool setting. And it has it also has a slow beginning, but is definitely, look, there's at least about 2 years difference. That means quite a lot in the life of a young child, but it could also be earlier. I want you to know that there's variability in that. And here we have production, which starts later, which also starts later for BFLA, but then the child is already much older. And I've put production there at age about 4.5, and I'll explain that in the next slide. Why? Because here I'm going to talk a little bit about the comprehension and production gap. Now, both BFLA and ESLA children understand more than they can say in 2 languages, and I think that's the same for all of us. We all understand much more than we actually say. We can all read Shakespeare, but don't write like him. Just to show you, there is difference, a comprehension-production gap in speaking and in reading and writing. So what would be the typical time period between first word comprehension and first word production in BFLA for both languages? It's about 8 months. That's quite well established. So then in ESLA, for the first language, because we're comparing them to monolinguals, it's about the same. It's also 8 months for the LX. But how about the school language, the majority language? Well, this comprehension production gap, so the time between when they're first appearing to understand something of the second language and the time that they're starting to say something can be between 1 month, so very short, or it can be 2 years or even more. There is huge wide variability. And you see, so there's far more variability within ESLA than within BFLA. So it's much harder to predict what's going to happen with ESLA. Their variability is huge. And early childcare and preschool settings are the primary socialization units for ESLA. I mean, actually, I should have said for the school language in ESLA. That's what I should have said. What happens there is monolingual children, remember, there might have been the majority language in their general environment a little bit, but by definition, they're not being addressed regularly in that majority language. So they are monolingual, and they don't understand anything All of a sudden, they're catapulted into a situation where they no longer understand anything, where they are usually not understood either. So if you're 2.5, or if you're 2, well, if you're 2.5, it's maybe a little worse even. Because when you're 2.5, you have just started to be able to express yourself. You no longer really need to cry to get what you want. You can actually say words. And you have just discovered your power over other people, that you can get what you want. You have just started to be able to argue in a language, because people understand you, and you can argue with them and get what you want. When you're 3, you're even better at that. You've gained some self-confidence in that. But hey, here you're coming to this preschool, and you very soon find out nothing that you say has any effect, because they don't understand you. And this is extremely upsetting for young children. And there's research that says that, and I've written up some of that. So it's very upsetting for young children to be in this kind of a situation. And it can help explain, according to some authors, the often very long silent period in early second language acquisition. The silent period is supposed to be a universal period in early second language acquisition. Well, it may not be. It may not have to be. I mean, it's not nice for a child to be in early child care or in preschool and then, to just sit there and feel, they're not part of what's going on, and they don't want to engage because they don't want to make a fool of themselves, because they feel bad, they feel uncomfortable doing so. That is the silent period. It's really a very traumatic situation for children to be in, and we have some studies that document that. Now, BFLA children, they do not have this comprehension problem. And they are probably also, if they hear the school language at home, which I'm assuming now. So they are used to wide variation in the input from the very start, because this is something else that may startle these ESLA children to be, is, they didn't realize that there could be things that one doesn't understand. It's not in their realm of experience, who knows? And so BFLA children, their experience is very different. They learn to understand words from 2 languages, as I said, from the first year of life. So this is truly, I think, one of the most basic differences. Let's get to, indeed, what words that BFLA children actually learn. And let's talk a little bit about vocabulary size. I'm drawing on my own work here, which has found that at the age of 13 months, BFLA children understand totally, when you're looking at what you should be looking at their total word knowledge, that means you combine both languages, that they understand 70% more words than demographically matched monolingual 13-month-olds. And I will talk tomorrow in the workshop about what that means, demographically matched. And so BFLA infants reach a level of word comprehension that it takes monolingual infants, according to CDI norms, and I'll talk about the CDI Communicative Development Inventory tomorrow also, that it takes monolingual infants at least 4 months more to attain. And there you have some of the numbers. And also by age 13 months, BFLA infants understand translation equivalents. So this is all a very different picture from ESLA, who at 13 months, most children who are going to become ESLA probably won't be ESLA yet. They're monolingual. So this is a really big difference between BFLA and future ESLA children. I think it's really important to realize this. So very often we hear of a lexical disadvantage for bilingual children as a whole in comparison to monolinguals. And for instance, in a big meta-analysis of studies that she has previously done in her lab, Ellen Bialystock showed that young bilingual children do worse on a common word-picture association task, the PPVT, in English than age-matched English-speaking peers. She only looked at English. And these children were, the bilingual children were acquiring a whole range of different languages. Now, I think there is an issue here, namely that this result has to do with the amount of time that children have had to learn words versus the fact that they are bilingual. We just saw in the previous slide that bilingual children that are demographically matched to monolingual children, that they're in fact far ahead in comprehension. And I'm just comparing comprehension because the PPVT is just about comprehension, basically. Yes, so the bilinguals mostly did not hear English from birth, whereas the monolinguals all did. And the bilinguals in Bialystok's study, as I established through email contact with Ellen afterwards, were mostly ESLA children. So they had so for some children who were tested at age 3, it was possible that they had just joined that preschool a month before being tested. So all bilinguals are not the same. We can assume that. And it only makes sense to compare bilinguals to monolinguals if the overall learning opportunities have been similar. And I'll talk about that and how important it is to know who you're dealing with in your studies to make any claims. Here are some similarities between BFLA and ESLA, because it's not only differences but also similarities. So I already mentioned that the school language, yes, all bilingually raised children eventually end up speaking the school language, unless, of course, they have language learning problems. And there is uneven development across languages. It's completely normal. So one language can be better developed than the other, or certain aspects of one language can be better developed than aspects of another. And this may change over time in response to changes in the environment. And yeah, all bilingually raised children, whether BFLA or ESLA, they may combine words from 2 languages in one utterance. That's called a mixed utterance. And all of them will usually not speak a language that they know their interlocutor will not understand. And you know that's already what happens with these ESLA kids-to-be who are arriving in a preschool setting, being monolingual. And yeah, that's what happens to them. And I've read reports that it takes about 2 days for some of these children to then stop talking. Because in the first 2 days, they're not realizing quite yet, oh, we're dealing here with another language. You know, they're still bubbly and they're still so excited about being in preschool, they're still talking. And then they kind of fall silent. So because they know they're not understood. And fast attrition of a language is possible for any bilingual child. But as I've shown before, there's higher chances of that in BFLA, much higher chances in BFLA than in ESLA. And fast relearning, and that's the good news, is also possible. So you're going to change the environment, have more supportive learning settings, and boom, you've got relearning going on. And for all bilingual children, there is extremely wide variation amongst them in their overall language proficiency. In fact, I wanted to go just quickly back to this here. Just have a look here maybe at the BFLA children, their French and Dutch words that they comprehend, that they understand. Look at the range. I do ranges all the time because I think it's really important to show the variation. So there's one child who only understands 16 words, one bilingual child, for both languages combined. And then we've got the top performing child with 564 at the very same age. So that child understands 564 words. Compare that top performing child with the top performing monolingual child with only 326. You've got 2 languages there, so there's just much more of a mass of words, and much more of a range of variation possible because you're dealing with more than one language. Okay, all right. So I'm here going to show you I'm going to switch now a little bit to morphosyntax, just a little bit. I'm going to show you an example of uneven development in BFLA and give you a nice example I hope, from two Italian-Swedish bilingual children, BFLA children, Lina and Lucas, who used utterances of very different lengths in each language. And I just have to tell you that, for those who may not realize, utterance length in itself for young children is an important marker of grammatical proficiency. And these are data from Bernardini in 2003. So we have here Lucas, and actually it's the lighter bars that show Lucas's mean length of utterance, so the average length of his utterances in Swedish. And you see that they grow nicely. It's the light bars, as you would expect. And then you see the dark bars, that's his Italian. And you see that there is a huge difference. Well, it doesn't have this nice rising slope. It has kind of like it goes up for a little bit, then down again, and then at age 3, 4, back up. But what you also see is that there is a big difference between his Swedish and his Italian. Which by age 3, 4, well, there is still a big difference with just an MLU of 8, and for Swedish, an MLU of 14 seems very high, doesn't it? Yes. Then we have Lina, and she has a different start. So she starts with the MLUs being similar for Italian and Swedish. Now, mind you, are MLUs cross-linguistically comparable? Not really, but you have to look at the richness of bound morphology in the languages that you're comparing. But anyway, we see here for these young ages, well, if it's a little bit over 2, well, Lina's doing similar things probably in Swedish and Italian. And this wasn't the only analysis that Bernardini gave. But then we see that her Italian is just taking off, as we would expect, and her Swedish is not following. In fact, her Swedish is even getting worse. So if we compare the Swedish to the Swedish, she's doing much worse at age 2, 9, and she's just not growing in Swedish. So that's uneven development. There's two things that are going on in these two different languages. So, and let's see, I'm making a little brief excursion to when children are much younger, when they're BFLA, when they're 7 months old, in early speech perception. That's really where everything starts. And there's been this fantastically innovative work by Gervin and Worker from 2013, who made a study of artificial language learning, actually, in 7-month-old bilinguals. And they showed that really, at that age already, children are able to use prosodic cues to learn about word order, and which allows them an entry into the different grammars that they are learning and that they are exposed to. That is, if the basic word orders and the phrasal and sentential prosodies, that if they're actually different across languages, which usually they are. And later morphosyntactic production may be an outcome, an eventual outcome of these early perceptual abilities and different links between prosodic aspects and morphosyntax. But we really, this is such an exciting space to work with. We really don't know much about that, but we do know about is that in morphosyntax, so when children are much older in their production of morphosyntax, of sentences, that it develops separately in each language. So we're looking here at children at least 2.5 and older, so when they really have already multi-word clauses. And so the morphosyntactic development of the one language does not have a fundamental effect on the morphosyntactic development of the other. Only talking about morphosyntax here. So far, we haven't found any counter-evidence, or what people haven't found counter-evidence. And actually, I had a student ask me the other day, she said, well, the SDH is no longer that interesting because, is anybody still working on it? After all, it's established fact. I said, I said, well, yeah, it's much less than it used to be, but occasionally there are still people who are looking for it, who are doing it, but also, you know, you really do need case study. It's not so simple to actually truly analyze that. And in any case, for the children that, in those studies where people have looked at this, it has been shown for a variety of measures that BFLA children approach the morphosyntax of each of their input languages as basically closed sets. So what BFLA children do in one language has no systematic, and that's important, no systematic effect on what they do in the other one. So there's no evidence of cross-linguistic comparison procedures. And also, in addition, the sentences that BFLA children produce, they sound like those of monolingual peers in each language. Not necessarily monolinguals at the same age. First of all, there's wide variation amongst monolinguals, and then we have this issue of uneven development, which is to be expected. So it's not because a child is very proficient in one language that they'll be very proficient in the other, as we've just shown with Lina and Lucas. But what they're saying, well, could come from a monolingual child in terms of morphosyntactic features. Now, what little evidence, because there's really very little evidence on ESLA and on the developments, mental stages that happen there, but what little evidence there is suggests that in the new L2, ESLA children often show influence from the L1. So there's no separate development for each language. To what extent the L1 is influenced by the L2, well, most people who are studying ESLA will only look at the L2 and they don't take into account the L1. But I would imagine that if you're just at the beginning of learning the L2, you're not going to have much influence from the L2 on the L1. Maybe when children are older, this starts to happen after age 6. In any case, the L2 is influenced for many kids by the L1. I mean, for many kids, for those that have been studied. And the early sentences, regardless of cross-linguistic influence, the early sentences in the new L2 that ESLA children produce, they do not sound like those of peers who learned that language from birth. And yeah, so I already mentioned, yes, so the errors are often, but not exclusively, relatable to morphosyntactic patterns of the L1. And there can be, and evidence has been found of systematic cross-linguistic influence. At the same time, this is very difficult when you're studying ESLA. You have to actually really know, in order to be able to interpret the errors that are being made, you have to have a deep knowledge of the children's L1, and that's often not the case. And if you don't have that knowledge, how can you show that there's cross-linguistic influence? So yeah, as I've already said, there are other kinds of errors, but we know very little of specifics of L2 development in young ESLA children. I've already noted the huge variability, and there is huge variability because of this cross-linguistic influence. There's huge variability also based on the specific language pairs that children are acquiring, yes. And also, and this has been really shown for the very first time, Jim Cummins has always had this hypothesis that the first language will affect the learning of the second language. Well, the first real hard empirical evidence comes from Winsler, Kim, and Richards, 2014, where they really show that children who spoke Spanish very well compared to other peers at the same age, that those children who were up there for their Spanish, that they were the ones to develop English proficiency faster and better. So there is this variability also caused by children's just proficiency in their first language. And obviously, the extent of their language L2 learning opportunities. If nobody really talks to them one-on-one in the classroom, that's not going to help their learning of that new language, for instance. For phonology, there's more and more evidence suggesting that BFLA children tend to use the phones and prosodic patterns that are appropriate to each of their respective languages. It's very difficult to say anything about separate or joint systems, and the question is that important? But it is much clearer that ESLA children show clear influences from their L1 phonology on their pronunciation of the L2. Again, there's a huge range of variation there too, but that tends to be found more. And of course, variability within both BFLA, ESLA, and we need to explain this variability too, of course. And for instance, in the next two slides, let me just show a little bit of variation amongst BFLA children and talk about the importance of parental input patterns. So I'm here looking again at my survey data for 1,356 bilingual dual parent families, so families where both languages are present at home, but you have very different parental input patterns. One parent may speak only one language and the other only the other. That would be the third one from the bottom. So suppose it one person, one language. Then both parents may speak both languages at home. So it's the one in the middle. And then on the top we have one parent speaks the X language and the school language, and the other parent also the X language. And then on the bottom pattern, on the bottom we have both parents speak the school language and one parent in addition the X language. And see, this all makes, we can correlate that with whether children speak both the X language and the school language. And there's huge differences in function of those parental input patterns. So there's something going on there, definitely. So we have a 93% success rate, so to speak, in the top pattern and 34% only in the bottom pattern. So if we compare those two, what could be the underlying causes for these huge differences? Maybe it's absolute input frequency, but maybe it's other things as well. And I think we need to really investigate those things, because it's important for families. I've had people cry, saying, well, have always spoken just one language with our children. My husband one language, me another language. And the child is now age 4 and he can't talk to the grandmother. This is really very, and people feel, and parents feel failed as a parent. So this is really not helping in harmonious bilingual development of families and the children in those families. So let's get back to the question. Are all young bilinguals the same? Most certainly not. The basic developmental trajectories for BFLA and ESLA, they're really in the first 6 years of life. It may change afterwards, but in the first 6 years of life are quite different. And the existence of these differences is really the reason why, in working with young bilingual children, it's imperative that both scholars and clinicians obtain information about children's language input histories. And I've recently, I already wrote that first, but now it's for the first time in English that I wrote like a protocol that clinicians in screening children for possible language learning difficulties can use based on the difference between BFLA and ESLA. It's finally coming out, I think. Maybe it has just come out, I hope. So it's really important to know, are you dealing with BFLA or ESLA, to interpret what's going on with the child and whether there might be a problem. Also in clinical practice, also for your theoretical positions, it's also important to know what kinds of children you're dealing with. For instance, if you're interested in this separate systems idea, you need to know, does it make sense to even look at it in ESLA children? Maybe not, maybe yes. You need to realize that there are these basic differences. And also parents and policymakers, they should also be made aware of the need to distinguish between those two. Very often, it's assumed that there's just ESLA. Very often people talk about the home language and the school language as if the twain never meet. But as I've shown, there's lots of families where both languages are being used. And very often people make decisions about that. Also, they make decisions like, for instance, in the PISA studies, those huge studies to measure educational and compare educational achievement on a global scale, except for one run, namely in 2012. There is no students at age 15, for instance, they'd have to indicate, well, do they speak, the school language at home or the non-school or another language? Well, and what if I speak two? What if there's two languages? Well, you can't. Then how do you decide? In what category do you put yourself? There is no category because it's assumed there's just two. So all these things are really important because then on the basis of the answers to those questions, there's all kinds of filters and all kinds of analyses that are made just on the basis of that. So this is really crucial. Expectations need to be appropriately set and policies adjusted. How do you deal with, in your classroom, in a preschool, how do you deal with BFLA children rather than ESLA children? There should perhaps be a different approach. So these are all issues that rely on this difference in the early stages between these two kinds of bilingual children. And with this, I thank you for your attention.